us right now in a very important interview, important conversation. Andy Purdy's here, Chief Security Officer of Huawei Technologies U.S. Huawei's outside counsel is also here. Glenn Nager, a partner at Jones Day. Good morning to both of you.
Good morning.
Help us understand your position here, because I think there's a couple of things going on. One is what took place overnight, which is a bit separate, I believe. I mean, they're all connected in some ways, but a bit separate from the full-on blacklist. So just explain where we are and what's happened in the last 24 hours, and then we can get into some of the details.
Right. So yesterday, Huawei filed a motion for summary judgment in its constitutional challenge to the 2019 National Defense Authorization Act, alleging that under well-established United States Supreme Court precedent and Federal Court of Appeals precedent, that statute violates the Bill of Attainder Clause, the Due Process Clause, and the vesting clauses of the United States Constitution, because in that law, Congress has acted not only as the legislature making rules, but enforcing the rules against Huawei, whereas under the United States Constitution, the enforcement of the law is the prerogative of the executive branch, and everyone's entitled to their day in a duly constituted independent Article III court, and this law deprives Huawei of those rights.
Well, let me ask you a question. If the executive branch, if the president or the Department of Defense were to decide that a company represented a national security threat, you don't believe that they have the authority to make that decision?
We're not contesting that the United States government has authority consistent with the rule of law to protect the United States against security threats. What the lawsuit is about is saying that we have three separate branches of government, and each branch of government has to be allowed to play its role. And Congress here has tried to play all of the roles all by itself, and that's what's unconstitutional about this statute.
Let me ask you separately the sort of larger question here. We had Secretary of State Pompeo sitting literally here last week, and we asked him the question, and we said, does this company really represent a security threat? Is there something you can point to directly in terms of what the company has done with a backdoor or something else? He couldn't point to something specific, but he said in no uncertain terms that this company represented a absolute national security threat to the United States. You're both Americans. Do you not believe him?
Well, the United States government at the highest security levels have provided information to the United Kingdom and Germany that has convinced them that the U.S. government has no evidence of significant cybersecurity wrongdoing by Huawei. The U.S. is worried more about the country China than about the company Huawei. And the United States is not ready to address the most sophisticated cybersecurity risks generally. So they're bending over backwards to try to make sure America's safe. Right. And we think we got to, ramp down the rhetoric and address real cybersecurity.
Let me ask you a question. As American citizens, both of you, which I believe you are, and here's where the complicated part is. Let's say there has been no wrongdoing thus far. Let's just presume that, even though I know that unto itself may be a debate with some people. The argument here is that Huawei, given how far ahead the company is in terms of its technology, if it were implemented around the world, even if it wasn't implemented in the United States, but was implemented in all of Asia and all of Europe and Africa and South America became the standard, right? And that if China as a government decided a year, 2, 3, 4 from now to somehow decide that they wanted to use either backdoors or use that technology to spy or somehow look at other pieces of what we are doing, or and by the way, our systems are going to have to interface with these systems in the future, that potentially poses a national security threat.
The new standards require interoperability. The most important networks in the world will require diversity of suppliers to help make sure we maintain resilience. It has been proven that there are risk mitigation measures that are adequate to the United States government. Take the case of Nokia, which has their joint venture with Shanghai Bell, owned by the China government. Deep roots in China, deep connections with the China government. Despite that, the U.S. has found risk mitigation mechanisms that allow them to trust Nokia in the United States. We just want to have those conversations with the U.S. government about effective risk mitigation measures.
You talked about how it's not necessarily Huawei, it's about China. So if Huawei became something that enabled China to do something absolutely horrific in the future, looking back on your efforts, would you question? And what I'm referring to is, this is in New York Times, how China uses high-tech surveillance to subdue minorities. There's an entire area with high-tech surveillance. And the worry is that eventually they're going to use this technology to strengthen, and this I'm quoting from the piece, strengthen authoritarianism at home and abroad, and that would directly affect us. So you guys could be enabling the eventual Chinese regime to, I would say that in a lot of ways the United States wears a white hat in terms of human rights and everything else. I'm not so sure about China. I mean, do you want to be in a position where you enable that technology to spread in authoritarianism around the world? Is that okay with you guys?
Absolutely not. And that's not what we're talking about here. We are talking about the fact that there are tremendous benefits that can flow from this technology to jobs of our customers and jobs of our suppliers. And there are mechanisms, and the principal deputy of the director.
How do we know that?
The principal deputy of the Director of National Intelligence said that the problem of backdoors can be addressed by testing, and she incorrectly stated that those who own the equipment can take all the data. If we don't have the data, China can't force us to turn it over. So there are mechanisms that can create assurance and transparency, right. And it's worth it for the benefits that are going to flow to the United States.
We had a brigadier general, a former brigadier general, who served on the National Security Council and who's written papers about this here yesterday, and he said, look, this is a significant threat because there are backdoor options that have to be created, that this is the situation with China, and the very way that China sees things is counter to the way Western countries do this.
Well, you say counter to the way Western countries are doing this, but our Constitution, the way we create our liberty and protect our democracy is through our separation of powers. And when our Congress ignores the separation of powers and acts unilaterally...
So you'd like to see the executive branch jump in on this?
It's the one that's acting authoritarian.
Okay, that sounds almost like like a technical argument. I can understand what you're saying, and I can see the point that you're bringing. Let me bring up just the idea of piracy and IP theft with Huawei, going back to this, which is a separate attack entirely, but it's also one that's brought huge concerns. There was just an article in the Wall Street Journal that talked about a former Huawei HR manager who said in court documents the piracy was so flagrant when it came to the Cisco routers that the bugs were even copied in the Huawei ones, and they couldn't release them. Even the typos in the manuals for using them were copied to that extent. There's user-specific tilt technology that was stolen and applied for a patent using a document that still had the company that created it, Quintel's names on that information, and a Brazilian company that came to the United States government and said that Huawei approached them and said that they would give them free equipment if they would turn over Tech-elect gear so that they could be reverse engineered. What do you say just about the theft of IP, which goes to the heart of this trade debate?
I don't forgive acts that have happened in the past.
Some of these are very recent in the last couple of years.
Despite those, our allies have decided to push back on tremendous pressure from the United States government because they believe the national security threats can be addressed transparently.
But you don't argue with any of this IP theft, which is why Huawei's in the position it is?
I think the geopolitical context between the U.S. and China is why we're in this situation, where the experts in government are not willing to talk with us about proven measures to mitigate the risks.
So let's talk about those measures. What would have to be implemented? What do you think Huawei would be willing? We can negotiate it right here at the table. What would Huawei be willing to implement in terms of the hardware in its technology and the oversight of the manufacturing of that technology and the testing of that technology, such that you think that the Department of Defense and the United States government could be satisfied that it wouldn't be used nefariously?
In different countries in the world, we negotiate with the respective governments on what kind of assurance framework they need, whether it's testing of the products, whether it's monitoring of compliance. So that's what we did in the United Kingdom. That's what we have operational in Canada. That's what Germany's working on. The EU is working on very strong requirements. We're not going to prejudge what the requirements will be to do business in the United States. It might include things like we can't sell to the government. It might include things like we can't sell into critical infrastructure. And that there may be some kind of compliance monitoring, some kind of code evaluation, like we've opened up in Bonn. And
do you think is that acceptable to you? That you wouldn't be allowed to sell into the government? That you wouldn't be allowed to sell into critical infrastructure?
I can't prejudge because the people who pay my check have not told me, but I'd be astounded if we wouldn't be open to those kinds of risk mitigation measures.
In terms of where we go from here and some of the things that Huawei has said over the past 2 weeks in terms of what the limits of this blacklisting will do to the company. You've said thus far that you believe that if, for example, Android were taken away from you, that there'd be a software not patch, but another kind of operating system that you've developed, that you have enough hardware, all of that. Can you sort of explain? There's a lot of people that are skeptical that even 12 months out that you would have that software, that you'd have enough of even some of the hardware in place.
We started our business continuity planning like 20 years ago with help from IBM. A year or two ago, we ramped up our Plan B to try to make sure we have components and the supplies ready. Whether or not at the 1 year mark we're going to have an impact on certain components, we're going to have some difficulty. Our revenues may slow. But one thing is certain, if we're going to cut off our nose to spite our face and we're going to harm the suppliers who supply us, they are in fact going to be harmed with concrete results. And their customers who depend on us in serving rural America, they're going to really be hurt. We know those things are true. So we hope we can ramp down the rhetoric and we can have discussions about how we can address the real risks in cybersecurity in a transparent
Is there
manner.
a direct conversation that's happening right now at all at the company level with the U.S. government, or is it strictly Chinese government to government?
Well, first of all, we aren't interested in being involved in the trade talks because the China government doesn't speak for us and we don't speak through the China government. Other than some preliminary conversations with the United States government, we are not yet having substantive conversations with them. We believe our suppliers and customers probably are.
Pompeo the Secretary did cite an existing law that Chinese companies are, by law, need to cooperate with the government. Are you familiar with that law? Is that a red herring or?
Well, it's a red herring in several respects. We don't think that's what the law says, but we also have heard some U.S. government officials admit that they don't think the law has any relevance whatsoever because they don't believe China's a rule of law nation and they believe we'd be forced to turn over whatever that we have. But that's one of the things that people don't understand telecommunications. Right. The operators control the sensitive data. We get written permission every time we access it.
That's not a great selling point that China's not a rule of law nation.
I'm saying that's the government's position.
The government. All right,
let me ask you something.
This is a very, the rhetoric, and it is high, but this is, I think, it's a little rich that Huawei's lawsuit is seeking protection under the U.S. Constitution. Should we even think about that an authoritarian country falling back on the laws we have as far as the Constitution? Does that bother you at all? Or?
No, actually, we should be proud of it. We should be proud that our legal system insists that our government comply.
Even if we end up losing this long-term Cold War with China, that at least we upheld the Constitution.
Well, that's what our nation stands for. But you're also assuming a conclusion that's never going to happen. Our government has plenty of authorities available to it to protect the people of this country, consistent with the Constitution.
Separate but related question: do you object to the Chinese cybersecurity law? The reason I ask is the Chinese cybersecurity law effectively requires all data, right, to be held in China, that's created in China, to be held in China by Huawei. And I ask because if you don't object to it, I think ultimately there's a problem here because that's part of the issue.
The legal opinions we've gotten from outside firms, including in the UK, is that the cybersecurity law in China does not apply to the equipment providers like us, that we are not required to turn over or retain data for them.
Okay.
British Telecom, by the way, did yank out a lot of Huawei equipment back as far back as December. You said that the other governments weren't listening to this, that they didn't buy into the argument that there's a security risk. But there have been a lot of companies in other countries that have removed Huawei.
I would disagree that there are a lot of countries that have had that situation.
There were 5 last week, 5 companies that did it.
Well, we'll see how some of these things play out when the facts are fully explored.
Okay. We want to thank both of you for joining us this morning. Really appreciate your perspective. It's an important one and a longer conversation and debate, and we hope to have you back as this plays out.